This is a photograph of me, of course, when I was very young. And my very first memory is of drawing pictures. I have drawn always. I was just a born to draw. And drawing comes more naturally to me than speech. I think it's really my primary form of communication. And I have been informed that I still stick my tongue out when I draw. But what I do, the kind of drawings that I did weren't static at all. Everything had to be moving and dancing, and I was just born to be an illustrator, born to do narrative illustrations. And this young character with curly hair is not holding two hamburgers. Those are actually castanets. So I also had an interest in music. And I loved watching cartoons when I was small. My favorite cartoons were Hanna-Barbera cartoons, and my very favorite character was Top Cat. And I actually went through a phase when I wanted people to refer to me as Top Cat. I was absolutely obsessed with him. And I'd sit in front of the television set on Saturday mornings with a big, thick stack of paper, and I would just draw through the entire stack of paper pictures of Top Cat and other cartoon characters. And my first books were actually comic books, because comics are just the perfect marriage of text and illustration. And I would just concoct all of these stories about Top Cat and his friends and draw them out with ballpoint pen or with crayon and staple them together on the side. So it's interesting that I didn't just go into a full-fledged cartoonist career, but or become kind of a nefarious trickster figure like Top Cat. My mother is really the person responsible for my love of books and reading. She loved reading out loud to my sister and me. She did it every night. And she had a wonderful way of narrating and bringing everything to life. She could make a plumbing manual sound like the most exciting epic story ever written. Another big influence was my father. My father was a professional portrait photographer, and he took this photograph of me years ago with a cat. Love cats. This is where I lived all through my school career on the bell curve of anything to do with math. And I was very lucky to have very understanding teachers. I had a biology teacher who knew that I would fail instantly if he gave me the same math related homework that he gave to everybody else. So he charged me with drawing mollusks, snakes, tarantulas, all these really wonderful characters or animals. And I did very, very well in his class. So this is just kind of a shout out to teachers, that teachers are so wonderful. The really, really wonderful ones find a way to help students connect with a subject that might be a little off track for what they would normally like. So I grew up in North Dakota. And I went to college at Jamestown College, actually. Wanda, hello out there. There's another Jamestown College grad here in the audience. College was 2 blocks from my parents' house in Jamestown, North Dakota. I knew I wanted to write and illustrate children's books, but I had no idea how to go about it. And unlike the East Coast, there was just no one doing art or illustrations or writing stories at that time, and there were no children's literature courses. So I loved the work of Maurice Sendak. And I read an article about him in Time magazine, and they said he lived in Ridgefield, Connecticut. So I thought, I'll just call Maurice Sendak and ask him how I should go about writing and illustrating books. And, he'd be able to help me, I'm sure. So this is a little like saying, I want to be an actor, so I'll just call up Nicole Kidman, and just ask her how I can get into the business. So I called Ridgefield Information. His number was listed. This is how long ago this was. And I dialed his number. He picked up the phone, and I said, "Hi, I'm My name is Barbara, and I'm from North Dakota, and you don't know me, but I really want to write and illustrate children's books, and how do I do it? And he was fantastic. He talked to me for 20 minutes. He told me how to put together a dummy book. He encouraged me to talk about putting together a collection of a portfolio of drawings. And I asked him, so when I moved to New York, should I go to art school? And he said, absolutely not. So they'll put so much garbage in your head, it will take you 10 years to get rid of it. And I was like, oh, okay. And I found out later at that very time he was teaching at the School of Visual Arts. So I don't know if it was just his mood that day. But so I followed his advice and moved to New York City. And this is the first book I illustrated, Potbelly Possums. And then I started working for Jim Henson, and there are probably those of you in the audience who know Fraggles. How many know Fraggles? Raise your hands. Yes. And this was the first book that I wrote and illustrated. It was a 48-page wordless picture book based on a story by Balzac featuring anthropomorphic animals. So as you can imagine, it wasn't like something that like people wanted to buy right away. So it was rejected by 15 publishers. David Godine was the 16th I sent it to. He published it, and it went on to win my first New York Times Best Illustrated Books Award. And The Gingerbread Man, this is probably my biggest selling book. So I kind of steal from my real life to, kind of as an inspiration for the pictures I put in my books. And this is the house I currently live in Windham, Connecticut. And the beautiful roses are thanks to my wonderful, marvelous, talented partner, David Johnson. There he is. Oh, he's such a sweetheart. And David happens to be a very, very famous illustrator himself, and he's very well known for especially his portraits. He used to do a lot of portraiture for the New York Times Book Review. His work has been printed in Harper's and the Atlantic Monthly. He's recently been doing things for the Wall Street Journal. And he really likes to draw beards. Get a load of that beard hair. He's doing something I would never do, not get near that beard hair. So this is my son, Larson. And Larson is a recent PhD graduate in East Asian Chinese language and philosophy studies. So if you need a Ming Dynasty manuscript translated, he's your guy. And this is my studio, all cleaned up. It really rarely looks like this. And here it is, looking a little neat, and usually it looks like this. I tape artwork up on the walls and prop things up, and it's a total disaster, usually. So these are my Adele and Simon books, and this is in print all around the world. And as I decided that Adele and Simon it would be wonderful if they could travel to China, which was inspired by my son living there for a while. And then he is very involved in martial arts, so I decided to do a book about a little girl who does martial arts. And I also have been, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more interested in trying to break away from just my old style. And again, to paraphrase Maurice Sendak, if you do the same style over and over again, you're just doing the same book. And I thought, I'd like to try this. And I used a brush tip marker, to kind of duplicate Japanese prints in this. A few years ago, Jenny Dunham, my wonderful agent over here, sent a manuscript to me, and she said, this is something from Little Brown. It's about a French mathematician. Now, you remember earlier in the slideshow where I was on the math curve, and I'm so math phobic, so I thought, like, at first, no, like, I'm going to have an anxiety attack. How could I possibly illustrate this book? But it was beautifully written, very lyrical, and I tried to find ways to connect to Sophie, and found ways to connect to Sophie. Sophie was self-taught. Sophie spent a lot of time by herself working in isolation, which, as you artists out there and authors know, is the way we kind of spend our life. And this book was interesting because usually I take a strictly narrative approach in the way that I illustrate books. But in this instance, if I had just drawn Sophie doing what she was doing in a strictly narrative way, it would have been Sophie sitting at a desk, writing and writing and writing and slowly getting older, which was not a very interesting way to narrate this story. So I thought that I would try to do things to pick up elements in the text and really, really make it into something very fanciful. So I used markers, colored markers, and bright colored colors in the numbers, and I really made the numbers become characters throughout the books as well. I was very inspired by the work of Robert Indiana, the American pop artist, and I tried to also bring elements into play. So Sophie lived in Paris during the French Revolution, and her parents kept her inside during the height of all of the riots and the violence. And it was while she was kept inside that she read books in her father's library and taught herself calculus and Latin and Greek. And the text again was pretty abstract. So I decided to make the numbers into characters in the picture to reflect the violence on the streets, and then as the numbers move around Sophie, they become ordered and kind of a protective environment for her. And another example of the text, so as you see, this is, it's like the French Revolution has simmered down. She wants to attend university, but women couldn't go to university in Paris at that time. So she kind of did almost like a correspondence course and signed her papers with a male pseudonym. But how do you illustrate this? There are a lot of ideas going on in this paragraph. You have Sophie, who is writing notes, sending things off, getting things back. She's reading. It was a very complicated thing to illustrate. So I saw this collage online, and I thought that would be perfect. I can show Sophie, I can show her connection and relationship with all of the books and the material that she's reading. And so I set about doing a rough sketch to demonstrate how I would show Sophie integrated with the material that she's studying and writing and the letters going off. And I downloaded images from online and that were in public domain, I may add, and cut them out and stuck them onto a flat piece of paper, or a piece of paper with a flat yellow wash. And then I reconstructed letters and stamps and cancellation marks. And I drew Sophie as she would appear on top of these images, and then I just used a kind of a gum material around the empty negative spaces so that I could paint over the whole thing and just pull that gum off. I didn't have to carefully paint around these open spaces. And I tried to match them up and overlay everything. And this is the finished product. Now, my wonderful art director at Little Brown's did all of the digital work and overlaid and everything. So this was sort of my sneaking up to doing digital work. So I do it all analog and let my art director do the rest. Poor art director. And so this is, Sophie eventually won a major award in France. The French government was offering an award to a mathematician who could come up with the mathematical explanation for sound vibration patterning. Because at that time, buildings could only be built up to a certain height because the vibration caused by wind or any kind of sound would collapse the building. So she came up with this equation after 9 years of studying, and this is the basis of all sound vibration patterning engineering or physics that's come since then. So she was really quite an amazing individual. And as I was doing this all these numbers, it wound up as 0. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my God, this lifetime of work, and it's like nothing? It's turned out to be nothing? 0? How depressing is this? And I was almost in tears. And I called my son, who's somewhat of a math geek, and he was like, this is terrible, how could this like be? And he said, Mom, you know what, in math, that's what you want. 0 means perfect balance. So it's just like, oh, okay, so the philosophy of math. So you know, every time you illustrate a story, you kind of extrapolate things from it, and it's a learning thing. Anyway, so when I'm not in my studio working or doing school talks, I am driving around northeastern Connecticut in my Audi TT sports car. And my editor at one point came up to visit me at my house, and he saw this car parked in my driveway, and he walked in the house and he said, I'm giving you a contract about a little girl and a sports car based on that car. And it was like, okay, sure, I like this. And he said, and you can write your car off, and it paid off all my car payments and everything with the advance, and this is very, very happy thing. And really, in my next lifetime, I'm going to come back as a sports car driver. I just love driving, and we're not going to get into the tickets and stuff that I've gotten over the course of my life. But the problem with being given something that is totally open-ended is, what do you do with it? What kind of story? So sports car girl, where does this go? So I was in Kyoto, and I saw this little push car in a shop window, and I thought, okay, so it's not going to be an actual car. Let's make it something small that is portable and really fun for her to ride. I can't stress how important play is as you're writing or drawing. You just really have to get into that space where probably any other grown-up, your next-door neighbor, for example, would probably think you were a little crazy. But so I collected toy sports cars, and I started playing around with my 10-10 figures. This has been a fender bender with 10-10 and Captain Haddock and Snowy. But it really helped me loosen up and start thinking about things. And then I thought that I would like to use an old toy of my father's, an old Suco Grand Prix racer car that was one of his favorite toys and that I played with when I was little. So it looks a lot like my TT, and this is kind of the nice lineup. And then I bought a little push car, pedal car that would be the correct size of a child-sized car. Another thing that I do as I start sketching and drawing is I make little paper cutouts. So I made a little drawing of Annie, the little girl in the car, and cut it out. And I fold it so it stands up. And I have her doing different things in different poses. I was very inspired then I also read a lot to try to get information about structuring a story. And I love Along a Long Road by Frank Viva. And I decided that this is what I really would like to do. It was just going to be a very simple story about starting out somewhere and going through the countryside, going through the city, over bridges, and coming back home at the end. But I wanted to make it a little beefier than just this. So my son recently introduced me to a video game, Grand Theft Auto. So I thought, okay, I'll embed some of this into this story too. So I worked on the dummy, and she jumps in her sports car, and she shoots out of the window. And so I had sent these little dummy sketches to my editor, and my editor called me up at one point and said, so I've looked at your dummy, and I've been sitting here with a pair of scissors and Scotch tape, and I've kind of cut things up and moved them around a little bit. I hope you don't mind. And it was like, okay, I'm old enough, I'm a grown-up, this is going to be okay. So he would incorporate various notes, and I tried different points of views. I wanted this to be a more cinematographic approach. And you can see here that originally I'd wanted her to just go over a little bridge over a stream, and he wanted me to make this a great bridge over a great river. So this is sort of the insight of what these little notations that editors can make. So I start out with a rough sketch, and I start developing it, and kind of figure out where the type is going to go. And for this book, I used a marker with a brush tip pen, a brush tip nib, and I get out my watercolors, my watercolor brushes, and I mix colors in ceramic nests that are like egg cartons made out of ceramics or plastic. And this is, my studio starts getting more and more busy and collected and messy. And I start figuring out what kind of colors I'm going to use. And this is the finished color piece that became the cover. So here is more of those little cutouts. So here's Annie. Get on your mark, get set, and go. And she blasts out of her bedroom window, and she starts driving north on Route 32. Wanda, remember Route 32 north of Jamestown? So, and she's heading off. So I wanted this to be a book about where you've been, where you are now, and where you're going. So she's heading up to the mountains, and there's this big lazy cloud in the sky. And this is North Dakota for any of you who've never been there. It is like truly really flat. And so I wanted to know what the mountain was going to, what did the mountain road look like? And I was doing a school talk in Bronxville, New York, and the school librarian had this screensaver on her computer, so I incorporated that into Annie going up the mountain where it is very cold. So she's been in the very, very flat area. She's up in the mountains now. She's going to come down into the desert. And no matter how simple the book is, there is always a lot of research behind things. And I love the work of Jacques Tardy, French illustrator and comic book artist. And I tried to pick up some of the sensibility of his drawing, some of the dust that's kicked up behind the car, and the colors to make this illustration. So she's zooming along. And then I wanted to, again, do a more cinematographic approach, and I used this car a lot. I drew a lot I know how to draw cars now, definitely. So I wanted to show her from behind. So you see where she's been in the rear view mirror, where she is now in the forest, and there's that structure off in the future. And because we just see the back of her head, I wanted to see her in this picture. And she zips across a bridge. She leaves the forest. She's heading into the city, going across a bridge. And my dad lived in St. Louis for years, so I wanted to show like the Mississippi, which has a lot of brown sediment in it. And she tears into the city where there are lots and lots of people, but there also happens to be lots and lots of traffic. So I used this little car to kind of get a sense of scale for when she's stuck in traffic. And also, this was a big, I just played with the style of this. It was really a lot of fun. So I used different colored lines because I wanted the color this to be kind of a simple shape book and really, really deal with color more than in other books that I've done. So she blasts off, and this is nya to all the traffic cops who've pulled me over. If you wanted me to state trooper, get a TT. And she gets onto the Indianapolis 500 racetrack, and she's like blasting along, and finally she's starting to get kind of tired. So you can see where she's going, that she is going to her familiar home in North Dakota, and she drives up a familiar street to a familiar house and blasts through a familiar living room and parks her car in her bedroom and reads with her dad and baby brother at the end. So it's just kind of a loopy, crazy story. And this is how it looks when you get your author's copies. It's like, yes, this is really wonderful. And shameless advertising, I've made stickers and t-shirts, front and back. And here's a real life Annie. Sweet little girl. So my next book is going to be a version of The Three Little Kittens. And unlike you've ever seen them before, they're very influenced by Top Cat and Hanna-Barbera cartoons. And this is a book I'm working on right now about the French photographer Jacques-Henri Lartigue, which will go back to some of my former styles in working. And now I'm going to introduce you to a very special guest we have here. My agent, Jenny Dunham, is with me, and this is a really fantastic and rare opportunity to meet one of the best agents in the business. Jenny represents people who write and illustrate children's books, graphic novels, adult fiction and nonfiction. Her authors, her illustrators have won numerous awards, and I'm going to embarrass her now and tell her that her some of her clients are Robert Sabuda, Nick Bruhl of Bad Kitty fame, and she has been just an amazing mentor. She has helped guide me through my career, and we've been at it for 20 years, and it's been really wonderful. So, Jenny, I want you to come up to the stage, and Jenny and I are just going to talk a bit about the agent-client relationship, so you get to know all of the backstory, the top secret information about what agents do.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
No. Yes?
Yes. Okay, you can hear me back there.
Okay.
I think I'm blushing.
This is kind of like an Ellen DeGeneres moment, isn't it? Or The View or something.
I know, right? We've even got the fern.
We do. So this
Is it real?
I don't think so.
No, it's definitely not.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So anyway, Jenny and I have been staying at the guest house for the Illustration Institute on Peaks Island, and we have had a lot of really wonderful conversations about what it is to be an agent. And one of the things that Jenny brought up was that she has recognized when she reads a manuscript or even when she meets an author and illustrator, she sees a kernel of something inspiring, a spark in that individual. And how do you do that? Is it an instant thing, or do you kind of?
You know, I don't know how I do it. I mean, I think I said to you, you know, Barbara, I have this curse because I see something so early and it's not ready. The person still needs years of practicing with the illustration or revising the manuscript, and I'm like, I can see that this person has talent or this project, but it takes a long time to get there. You know, it's exciting, but often that's not the moment to necessarily offer to represent the person, because, I mean, so let's just back up 2 steps and say that as an agent, I'm technically responsible for 3 different major things. The first thing is I'm going to submit the work to editors and to solicit offers. The second thing is to negotiate the contract. And the third thing is to collect and appropriately distribute the money. So those are the 3 basic things. Now, there are other things that happen in there, too. You know, for example, there are something like over 400 allied rights to every book that you can try to market. And I will admit very freely, I have never gotten even a fourth of the way there. I'd be impressed if any agent did. But so there's a lot of other things to do besides those 3 categories, or that are a part of those 3 categories. The biggest shift, I would say, recently is that editors have so little time. I mean, editors and agents do all of their reading in their free time. So editors want to buy manuscripts that are polished. You know, they don't want to spend a lot of their free time editing. So that means the onus is on the author or illustrator to make the work perfect up front, and the agent is that front line helping that person to get there. And there's a fine line. I mean, I'm not an editorial, you know, I'm not an editor, and I'm not a critique group. But those things are certainly very helpful in getting there, and I can give feedback. So you go to this spark, and it's so exciting. I mean, I think that one of the big thrills of this business, well, it should be getting in that car and driving around like that, right? But is when you sell a book, you get to call people up and say, I have an offer for you. And so you make people's dreams come true. It's exciting. I mean, even when to this day, how many years? It's been over 2 decades we've been working together.
Yeah.
And I still get excited to share a manuscript that you might illustrate that I think is really promising, or, to have another book contract for you. That's the fun part.
Oh, yeah, and also part of what happens in our communication is that we'll talk about a manuscript. So I'll get a manuscript in, and you'll say, this is perfect for your career. I can really see this building towards a certain point. Or you'll say, this is an interesting book, but I don't think that it's really going to move you in a direction that's going to really speak to your talents and that is really going to feed your career 5 and 10 years from now. So you also are able to help me select a manuscript and really definitely provide some kind of some management process, which is really, really important.
But I always come back to, how do you feel about it? Did you read it and did you feel that spark in you? And you'll talk to me, and I think I've used this, and you gave it to me. You said, I can't see the illustrations. I can't see the dummy forming in my mind. And I'll be, okay, that's it. I mean, game over. Like, what? It can't do anything with that.
Yeah.
So we've turned some of those down, and then there'll be times when I share something, you say you're excited, and then I get an email from you the next day, could we talk please this afternoon? And it'll be, I'm already like sketching the dummy out, I can so see this one, and I'll be like, okay, I'll call up the editor, she'll be thrilled.
Yeah, and I think that's really wonderful. And I have to say too, my editors have said that if they had to hire an agent, they would hire you because you're really good. So I just have to toss that in. That's really nice.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
But with every client, because you also you work with people who sell in the adult market as well as picture book people, graphic novel people. How is it different with each of those groups? Your approach to, certainly the contracts must be different, but I would imagine how you introduce the material to both your client and also work with a publisher.
It's not, certainly each age category or each audience, has something different that's required for it, and children's books are very specific for, novelty, picture book, easy reader, chapter book, middle grade, young adult, just to name them all, and, adult literary fiction and nonfiction as well. But honestly, I think it more goes back to who is that creator and learning who they are in their process and what do I need to know to help them. If I am going to make a comment on a manuscript or a dummy, I'm going to think about, okay, what do I need? What am I hoping this person will do? And what is the message that I need them to have their ears open to hear? Because I can't help them unless they hear this message. And so it's trying to figure out who are they as a creator. And as we've talked about, there are people who need the security of having many contracts in place, and there are people who feel that's just too much pressure to deliver, and there are people who are good in working quickly, you know who I'm talking about, and there are people who
are not.
Yeah, exactly.
So you also have to put out some fires. So for example, if an illustrator is late on handing in some artwork, which certain individuals in this room
never happened ever for you, right?
So you have to kind of be a bridge between a slightly irate editor who may have to shift a schedule around and a very frustrated illustrator who's probably pulling all-nighters to try to reach, get the artwork done.
So that's one of the kind of fires that can happen. It's actually fairly common, but since editors and publishers schedule via lists they have, 2 or 3 a year, it's very important to them to keep those slots, and they have to juggle everything, how many titles are on the list, the budget for the list, publicity and promotion, which, as you know, only about 1/3 of books even get any promotion money these days. So the publishers allocate that. So if you have a chance of getting some of that money, you definitely want to. But, also just trying to stay in touch with my clients and how's it going? Are you on time? A couple of times, it's 4 months out or 8 months out, and I'll say, you know, I'm getting early indications. I'll call up the editor and say, we're getting early indications that this is running 2 months late. You know, what's your feeling? And I'll either hear, we really want this on the winter list. This is the ideal placement. We'd push it off a whole year if we can't make it. You know, and then I'll bring that information back and say, now look, can you put the gas pedal down? All these car metaphors I've been doing for a couple of days. You know, and sometimes the author or illustrator will say, okay, that's good information. I'm just going to see what I can do and try to push. And sometimes that push will do it, and sometimes that push will just stop someone. And I mean, there have been times when you got so frustrated with things going on that you've just put the work in a drawer and closed it shut.
With certain author individuals who were kind of, yes, a little difficult to work with, and everybody was kind of confused. Yes, that was.
This is where we'd better say that the author writes the manuscript, and that's usually purchased first, and then the publisher decides who will illustrate it and approaches illustrators. And just the illustrator should not be telling the author what the text should be, and the author should not be trying to tell the illustrator what to draw. Each one has to have the freedom to bring the creative vision of that story, because the idea is that the words and the pictures add up to more than just the two components.
The whole is better
Whole
than the
is greater than the sum of the parts.
Exactly. And so the editor really is kind of the traffic cop.
A little bit, yeah. Much more than that, obviously. But
Yeah, and that they bring their sensibility. So when you get a manuscript, like I'll send you a manuscript, and you'll read it and you'll say, you know, this editor would be perfect for this, and probably not so much this one. And so you know the editors, you know the art directors very well, you know maybe what a certain house is looking for at a certain time, and you are able to place things. Is that certainly plays into where you submit a manuscript?
True, although it's still, I mean, sometimes surprising. Sometimes I'll be sure this one is going to go to this editor, and it ends up going to that one, and I knew it was going to sell, but I couldn't have guessed it was going to happen this way. One time I sold a manuscript on the first submission, and I told the author, I was on the phone, we talked through everything. I said, I'm going to start with this one. And I got off the phone, and I thought to myself, actually, I'm not. That's not what I'm going to do. And I decided to send it to a completely different editor who ended up buying it. And I informed the author, emailed and said, by the way, I changed my mind. I'm sending to this one instead. And it worked out fine, but so it's not a science. There's, it's kind of that you can't put it into words sometimes.
So there's a lot of intuition in what you do, and you have to connect with. So do you like? Oh, I didn't ask you this question back at the house, and I just came up with it.
Go for it.
Do you like all of your authors and illustrators? Or is it just me?
Is that a trick question? Actually, I do like all of my clients. I mean, life is too short to work with people who are, I didn't say that, who are jerks or not professional or, I mean, it's a small business. It's a business where everybody knows each other, and be a professional, act like a professional, and yeah, I mean, generally speaking, it's a nice group of people who are supportive to each other, and the more good books we have, the better it is for the whole industry. So, and my clients are in general very, very nice people and very talented.
Bring it out in us. I'm sure that's really good. So I'm just wondering, maybe people in the audience might have some questions for Jenny. Here's this,
or Barbara,
pulling back the curtain here. Yes?
Could you talk about how you got into the business in terms of what studies you did or college? Yes, and was there somebody who guided you to the field?
Well, I got in it by accident. So I went to college. I did very well there. I went to a very good, well-known college. And I got out and I didn't know what to do with myself. And I knew I loved books, but I just wasn't sure what to do with it. And someone as a graduation present gave me a book called Author and Agent. And it was about Eudora Welty and her agent, Dermot Russell, and their relationship. And that was the first time I think I knew what an agent was or what an agent did. And I thought, okay, so that opened the door for that. And I did an unpaid internship at a publishing house for about 3 months. They sent me to a publishing headhunter, and I took the first job I was offered, which was at a literary agency, and it's been there. And the funny sort of adjunct to that story is that I worked for 2 agencies for a year, and then I got hired by Russell and Volkening. That's Russell as in Dermot Russell. And Eudora Welty signed that copy of the book to me. So that was really, I know, I get all like teary about that. I'll pull it together, sorry.
That's okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Barbara, thank you for sharing the kind of autobiographical turn and VROOOM. And, you know, it's interesting how with Annie you kind of showed a way to imagine yourself off the frozen prairies in some other world. And I really like the way that there's such a child's size view of her in the adult world. And I wondered if you think your illustrations of children's books help children imagine themselves into an adult world in some ways.
I sincerely hope so. I think that I know that when I was a child, looking at that sort of miniature kind of like venue, playing with toys, just having things that were small and miniature really helped me to connect, to feel more grown up. Maybe it's kind of practicing moving into the adult world. And we actually were talking about Maria Montessori not long ago, and she constructed furniture that was child-size before Maria Montessori, things where these children had to sit in adult-sized chairs and desks. So it's like scale is extremely important, I think, to help children to feel confident, to learn, to kind of make their way in the world. And I think, you know, my early childhood was a very happy time in my life, and I really go back to it again and again and again. I really enjoy doing all of that, and I don't know, I just like having fun. So I guess, does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? I'm primarily a visual person, so I came to writing as a way of creating the books that I wanted to do. So often I begin with drawings and sketches and doodles and those little cutout characters, and then I bring text into it. And I really so that there's a lot more time that goes into doing the drawings. And I really try to keep my text as simple and clean and direct as possible. So when I'm working on text, I might, you know, just read Emily Dickinson for, you know, days on end to try to get some of that rhythmic quality, or Dr. Seuss, or, but it's really, I think for children, I've really tried to sort of distill things to make the message as simple as possible. And as you could see in my presentation, there's a lot of research that goes into even the most simple drawings, and I think there's a lot of thought that goes into the text. But definitely for me, the drawing is foremost in the language that I use to tell a story. And Jenny, do you have?
Add to that. So you often start with the illustrations, but what I see first is often that short text. It's maybe 2 or 3 pages. I mean, most picture books are now less than 600 words. So very short. So I haven't even seen any of that. Or if you're sort of thinking in your way, which is very visual, I'll get a dummy, and Barbara makes these thumbnail dummies where a page is this size. I'm not kidding you. And I'll sit there like this, and and I can still see everything, and I can see your process of the topic, the text, and we'll go back and forth with the text several times. So even if illustrations are what bring you in, it's still starting with, if you're going to be the writer, what you send me first is the text.
And it's really just kind of an outline, and we'll start a conversation. So again, the strength of our relationship is that we'll start working on an idea, and then you'll say, Barbara, I think that we really need to move this little goal down here, and I'm like, I can't do that. Oh, just forget it. This is like horrible. I can't figure this out. This is too complicated. And then I wake up at 2 a.m. and I sit down with my laptop and I just write it out in like half an hour, and then I send it to you, and you.
So you'll tell me, okay, look, this weekend I'm doing this and this, so maybe by next Tuesday I'll have. And then in the morning I'm like, I was up at 3 a.m. and I did this. And it's, then there are times where it's like, okay, Barbara, my advice is go get a milkshake.
Yes, yeah. So the
You remember
Yukon
that?
Dairy Bar. Yes, I remember the summer of milkshakes. It was very.
But and then there are times when an editor comes with something and the two of you start working on it, and it's just not. I don't get that vision, And we had an incident recently, and I said, okay, you go in and you work together. The two of you are clearly on a wavelength, and I'm not on it. But I don't want to get in the way of that process. So you two start working on that, and we'll see. And curiously, the editor...
It was not acquired, even though she thought it was going
to be. The editor loved
it,
but she couldn't get everyone else at her house to buy it, so that project didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
But that allows us to keep talking about it, and,
And it might come out as something else, which is really good. But I think also, going back to the text question here, I think that for picture books, you can't, no matter how beautiful your illustration is, if you don't have a strong narrative to hold it all together, it just falls apart. It's just not going to really serve its purpose of relaying information and a wonderful story to somebody who's going to want to read it over and over and over again. And that's why I don't do fine art. I do books because I have stories to tell. So the text is really, really fundamental. It's the foundation of the book, and then all the rest is the beautiful architecture that you build on top of the narration.
I'd just like to add to that sometimes there are wordless books and there's still a story, that narrative. Even in a wordless book, there's a narrative there. So your point, but just, it doesn't, if there's no text, it doesn't mean there's no story. It just means 100% of the burden of telling the story is visual. So.
Yeah. Yes?
I love the books you've done with someone else. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Was that author that you had to maybe pull back from because you wanted to go in another direction? Or
Yes.
I mean, they were so wonderful.
Yeah.
Fox is my all-time.
Oh, and I love Tricky Fox too. Well, the door isn't closed with Jim, and we have there are trends in publishing, and you kind of have to swim with those trends or you sink. And so those tales were really appropriate. Librarians loved them at a certain point, but now I'm doing school talks. Did 2 school talks in Long Island recently, and both librarians said that there were a lot of issues now that people have with folk and fairy tales, that they're not appropriate to a sort of sensibility that's going on right now. And it actually has meant that I've had to push the pause button on a fairy tale that I love, but I have to pull back and find a different way with my editor to frame it, because if I do it now, I will be just annihilated by the Me Too movement. It's supposed to be a terrible thing. We don't want to do that. And if I'd published this book 10 years ago, this would not have been an issue at all. So it all is concurrent, actually, with a lot of movement in academia, and we're seeing a lot of it. Children's books are very affected by all of that sort of political ramification that everybody else and everything else is. Do we want to say this?
I'm not sure we're really at liberty yet to say which tale that is, to be honest.
So I'm here with my agent, my gag order. Okay.
Yeah.
So-
But I just want to point out, it's not that Barbara was working with Jim Aylesworth, it was that Scholastic was buying them and asking her to illustrate them. So it's not as if Jim and Barbara brought this to Scholastic. So
Yeah,
there
I
may
just
be
met Jim like 2 years ago.
There
even
may
though
be
we've been
something going on
illustrating.
with Jim in his career that we don't know too.
His
I don't know.
text is very wordy. I don't know if you remember that or not. And that is definitely out of style right now. So if he could just do, so with my grandfather's coat, my editor really worked with him to cut back on his text. And he loves to talk, he loves to sing. He does school visits and he sings the entire visit, everything he talks about. And he's wonderful, and I hope I can do more stories, but I think this wave has to crest and move on a little bit before we can go back to that.
The question right in the next row back.
Well, I think Nothing Stops Sophie is a really good example of that. As I got the manuscript, and actually it was the first manuscript this particular editor had acquired when she was hired on at Little Brown. And when I read it, I don't know what they had in mind that I was going to do. They were thinking it's in France. Barbara did Adele Simon, and so she'll bring that 19th century French sensibility to it. And I think they were surprised when they got the sketches that I did with these like 5-story high numbers, like rearing up out of the streets, and collage, and they went with it. They trusted me, and they followed through with it, and that was very fortunate. But I think that that out of when you run into a roadblock, and right now there are a lot of I can't quite. Even my drawing style, I mean, people love that steel engraving technique that I, kind of duplicate. But a lot of children don't read that way anymore. They don't read pictures that way anymore. And I speak in schools a lot. And I'm very attuned to the reaction that I get from kindergartners through 4th graders and 5th graders. And these are the people I want to reach with my stories, and that's very important to me. And so I want to find a way to access that. And I have a cousin who has a 17-year-old daughter, and she said her 17-year-old daughter swipes through, like Instagram and various pictures, and that the speed that children are reading visual images has increased exponentially. And she said her 17-year-old daughter reads images much faster than she does, but her 17-year-old daughter is slow in comparison to an 8-year-old. So 8-year-olds flip through, they read pictures really fast, and they want very clear, open, simple images. And if it's something complex, they should be sitting down and reading them and carefully thinking about them and reflecting on them, but a lot of them find it very hard to engage with images like that. So it's a complicated, so I've thought a lot about this, and I also have been going back, so I'm not young. I've been in this business for 40 years, and I don't want to do the same book over and over and over again, as Maurice Sendak said about doing the same style. So at a certain point, it's sort of like, what the hell, I'm going to look at my old child drawings, and I'm going to look at Top Cat and Hanna-Barbera, and I'm just going to see where I can go with that. It's just being playful and stretching things out and seeing what else I can do. but still having a foothold in what I used to do. Like the Jacques-Henri Lartigue book is going to go back to that older drawing style that I have, that I love. So I like trying these new things. It's really good.
I also just want to add, I mean, all of that is true and eloquent as usual, but how do you do that? It's not easy, but I think you've also reached out and you've talked about this, and we had one art director talk about competency fatigue, that Barbara was putting out consistently fantastic books every time, and they were consistently good, so people didn't notice anymore. And so we had some talks with various different editors about what to do, how could Barbara shake things up, how could she get people to notice again. So part of it was that we invited, that was, I think, part of what prompted that editor to go to your house and say, I'm giving you a contract for a book about a girl in a sports car. Was that being open to what topics, what presentation, what style, how could the style stay quintessentially Barbara and yet be different enough to get noticed. And I think you were really open to guidance, and being open to guidance at the right moment is very important. Your mind should be like a parachute. It should open when you need it to.
Excellent. Yes. Wait.